Welcome to my new series. I don't have enough of those yet. Well, okay, it's more an anthology of the mad rantings of a lunatic, but that's just a review. I'm making normal review videos now.
What do we think will be expected? Like, what are we gonna see from Chris Nolan?
All right, so I have a couple things that I'm gonna be looking out for. Authenticity in terms of the atmosphere of the film, and scale. I think the mythic scale is big for me. Maybe not as much as it would be in the Iliad, but Odyssey is still like an epic. It should feel big. And the only other thing is source material, faithfulness to source material, which it seems like Nolan cares about. So if you know me, if you know what I do, you know I care a lot about the Greek mythological canon. Homer is a big part of that canon, and remembering how much I enjoyed my initial read of Homer's epic has only made the Odyssey that much more important to me as an adaptational work. So while I wasn't going into this thing intending to hate it, yes, there was a part of me dreading the gross perversion of yet another story I care about. If anything, I wanted this film to open the door to more mythology at this scale. And that investment is personal. Mythic epics are so important to me as a storyteller because myth has this ability to detach us from today without detaching us from who we are. The gods and monsters make the world feel foreign, but the characters are universal and timeless. And that's what I think the Odyssey should be. So did it deliver? I think this might have been one of his, worst looking films. I don't know where I saw it, but I saw some Letterboxd review that was, saying something about it being, mythologically accurate. Bro, who the f*** said that? I thought Nolan simply didn't understand Homer. So much about the actual, plot is so dumb. They spend so much time on all the wrong things. There were some of these scenes, especially where people are just dying, that I'm like, this could have been an email, bro. This could have been a flashback. 100%. So much of that, especially the Last Draconian Giant bit, that could have been a flashback. We didn't need that to be drawn out into a 15-minute sequence. After stewing over this film for a bit, I'm pretty confident in most of my initial gut reaction. My big concern originally with Nolan was that he might prioritize the practical filmmaking and scale over the life of the characters. What I did not expect was to leave feeling that the way they tried to capture that scale was also drastically flawed. I spilled on my shirt. That's gonna be in the video. The argument is not that Nolan's film suffers because Nolan changed Homer. Adaptation almost necessitates change. But when you remove something that performed an essential dramatic function in the original, the replacement has to do at least the same amount of dramatic work. Before getting into what failed, I should probably start, though, with the things that actually serviced the film. The performances were serviceable. I can get into why exactly later. Some of the shots genuinely did look good. A lot of the trailer shots, like Agamemnon, the Cyclops, the ships, a lot of that stuff did look pretty cool. But chief among the virtues of this film was clearly Ludwig Göransson. And maybe this is a hot take, but I thought the score was pretty revolutionary, honestly. It didn't have a lot of themes, it didn't have a lot of leitmotifs, but the score itself evoked this ancient music through the instruments like the aulos, the lyre, the bronze drums, and just a lot of the texture of it felt very authentic, despite having that contemporary digital texture and bassiness that you don't often find in music like that. It doesn't attempt to resurrect or dig up the original musicians to ensure some unattainable fidelity, and it also doesn't paste generic blockbuster music over ancient Greece, which I greatly appreciate. It creates its own story through sound. It feels ancient without becoming this museum piece, and it also feels modern without diluting the identity that made the ancient music worth bringing back in the first place. And that's my core criticism against everything else in this film, particularly the writing. The music did everything the story and characters did not. And it proves modernization and fidelity were never mutually exclusive. The score remembers where this story came from while finding a modern language powerful enough for the scale that everyone was asking of Nolan. Ironically, the score understands adaptation better than anything else in this movie. I'll give Nolan this once. He knew the story he wanted to tell. There is a legible through line involving the Trojan horse, Odysseus' guilt, everything going on with that. Like, I understand what he's doing. The problem is that this one idea comes at the cost of what made Homer's story worthwhile in the first place. And it repeatedly requires Odysseus to become less intelligent whenever the plot needs him to reach Nolan's next thematic arc, checkpoint, which we'll get back to. First, though, the film makes Homer's world feel smaller before it makes its characters feel smaller. There is a difference between a film looking good and a film looking like itself. Many individual images work really well, especially like I mentioned in the trailer shots, but the film rarely feels epic. And I don't just mean epic, as in like the very expensive movie where people are all standing around looking badass, Avengers Endgame style. Like, it doesn't need to be that. The Odyssey should evoke another world, though, using that distance to make every island feel like it is a unique and different stop that expands what we are understanding about this world and what we're understanding about Odysseus' journey back to Ithaca and how far he still has to go. And man, I just didn't feel a lot of that. This film was shot on one of the largest theatrical canvases in existence, and somehow the experience is still pretty small. I mean, to me, I don't know, am I going crazy? One of the reasons for that is genre, and follow me here on this. Horror belongs in the Odyssey, obviously. The Cyclops eats humans alive, Circe turns men into pigs, but it becomes the governing language of the film instead of intensifying the individual episodes that it takes a part of. Polyphemus is this creature of the week, Circe is the Cronenberg body horror, which, by the way, that was another really cool part of the movie. I really liked that. But they felt so small. Look, individually these things can be interesting, but together they make the voyage feel like an enclosed survival horror instead of one vast homeward epic. Nolan's pretty effective at very certain specific things. I think the infiltration of Troy worked because the objective felt very urgent and immediate. But when it became the sack of the entire city, there was no sense of scale. Everything felt like styrofoam. And that smaller war drama, horror, psychological thriller kind of vibe, it's not what they sold for this movie. I mean, the posters, like, look at these posters. This is what they sold. They sold this. The posters and the marketing language, they promised the return of the mythic action epic. The kind of enormous historical Hollywood event that nobody puts on anymore. But the actual visual grammar delivered this claustrophobic war drama that happened to have monsters along the way. And this is where the IMAX conversation comes in. And the rhetoric around this movie treats the production method as if it's the finished artistic achievement. IMAX is a format, an exhibition system, a premium product. It's a product. Full frame 70mm IMAX is scarce. And the marketing tells one tiny group of theaters they have the, authentic experience. And I'm not trying to say that Nolan is cynical or business-minded, but it really detracts from the story itself when you're trying to make this thing pure through scarcity. The thing is, the composition's still going to have to remain legible in the widescreen version because most people are going to be watching the widescreen crop. The 1:4:3 image can add a lot of information, but if you're tailoring it for an audience that is going to see this much, what does this do? More sky above a tightly covered face does not turn a close-up into epic geography. It just changes the size of the frame. What matters is what you do with the composition that is inside of that. Another one of the Nolanisms that I kind of wanted to address while we're getting on it is The whole real ships, real sets, real explosions, that stuff is valuable, and it's good that people are recognizing that, but it's icing on the cake. Somewhere between the Homeric oral tradition and the IMAX popcorn bucket, I feel like we lost the sauce. You know? I feel like somewhere along the line we started reviewing the icing on the cake and not the cake itself. Which, I mean, fine, if you want to talk about the icing, that's cool, but like, the substance is kind of what I care about, to be honest. What makes this so infuriating to me is not that it was the worst film ever made, because it's not. What makes this so infuriating for people like me is that Nolan had a unique opportunity that no other filmmaker ever gets. This was Chris Nolan coming off of Barbenheimer. He had the money, the clout, the fancy cameras, the locations, and a marketing department that was willing to sell this event as the historical, can't be missed, once in a decade kind of thing. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how much of a gem that is, like, we're squandering it for this? He had every opportunity, and the Odyssey still felt small. The Odyssey. This isn't an outcry that not every single shot feels epic. There's a lot of moments that feel appropriate. A lot of the handheld, shakier footage feels good when they're doing the war scenes. A lot of the, you know, shallow focus that they're using on a lot of these character moments is really good. Isolates the face really well, but the ratio just wasn't there. The shots become unstable when we need that geography, while moments that should draw emotional weight from the character's relationship to the world becomes tight coverage of their expressions. And we really just, we need to, more, you know? I remember the close Penelope and Telemachus shot as a clear, like, they really messed up the focus pull on that. There are some moments where it is so hard, and I get it. It is not easy to pull focus, especially with these cameras, I'm sure, but like, that's reshoot worthy. And I mean, that's like, not even getting into the whole dynamic that Penelope and Telemachus have in that scene, in all of their scenes, really. Which really brings me into the whole character dynamics and a lot of the way that these people talk to each other, which dialogue, oh boy. The dialogue is atrocious. That first scene with Telemachus and Penelope is basically 50% exposition, if not more. It's just some of the most bland, uninspired dialogue that anybody could possibly write. I have no idea why Nolan is so proud to put his name as the only writing credit on this. And a lot of that exposition in that initial scene is stuff that all these characters already know and have known for 20 years. And the only time we do get some emotion is really only from Penelope, to be honest. But her emotion is so strange in this because it's so volatile, where you'd think that having spent this much time dealing with her grief and her lost hope, you know, there would be more of a recessed wound that she's dealing with. But no, she is angry in this movie. And like, the performances, they're difficult to judge, honestly. Like, a lot of the actors, I think, are genuinely really good actors, broadly speaking, but they don't really get a lot to do here. Even Matt Damon, the titular character, is like, he's Matt Damon. I don't know. Tom Holland is pretty cool. He just fit the character, I guess. There's not really much more to it. John Leguizamo was good as Eumaeus. A little bit of Sid the Sloth in there, but, you know, it worked. I liked it. The clear standout was Robert Pattinson, obviously. He was such a caricature, and somehow he made it work. I have no idea. That dialogue had no right to work as well as it did coming out of his mouth, but it's Robert Pattinson. What are you gonna do? The man's a legend. But like, the actors are not the fundamental problem here, right? The fundamental problem is what Nolan decided that these characters are for. I mean, I'll be honest, the visuals might have been the main talking point of this. There might not have been a video had it not been for how atrocious the writing actually was. I was really annoyed by how often this film took these vast systems that Homer had built and compressed them. The whole Xenia, Zeus's Law thing is one of the first examples of me starting to be really annoyed at how Nolan is taking these things, these systems that Homer has built up through Greek culture, and has just reduced them into these basic boilerplate concepts. Xenia is, in the Homeric tradition, this reciprocal guest-host friendship bond sort of thing, where the host gives protection, shelter, the guest respects the household, doesn't exploit them. That's basically the deal. I'm pretty sure Zeus's law in this is pretty explicitly the golden rule of the Bronze Age, where Telemachus, I think, outright says, do to others as you would have done to you, because you never know if a stranger is going to be disguised as a god. Which that actually has basis in the mythology. It's just so reductive and yeah, that's my argument. He flattens Xenia into this slogan and expects it to connect the dots of all of these things, and it doesn't work. It strips the story of all of its soul. He makes Zeus's law part of this structure that he's constructed this story around that is connected to Odysseus's guilt and the collapse of civilization. None of that was... none of that is what the Odyssey was about. The Cyclops is where this reductiveness becomes pretty impossible to ignore, because Homer connects hospitality, intelligence, pride, consequences, wrath of the gods. It's all connected. It's all super cultural. And it's impossible to disentangle those concepts when you're talking about Homer. Odysseus invokes the protection of Zeus. Polyphemus rejects it. But he's this speaking shepherd with a household and his own contempt for the social order that Odysseus represents. He's not just some animal that wanders into the plot to eat soldiers, which is what this one does. Granted, it's creepy and it's cool, but it doesn't do anything for the plot. None of these island-hopping adventures are respecting this culture that is inherited by the film. I mean, he does, of course, keep the basic bones of the story intact, which I guess is more than you can say for a lot of adaptations. I haven't seen any of the other Odyssey adaptations, so I couldn't even say, but a lot of the surface level details were kept intact. He keeps the cave, the rock, the sheep, the eye being poked out, all that good stuff. But the point of the myth in Homer was to show Odysseus's cunning, his pride, and all of these things that really amount to his character. They're important parts of his character. They're just not there. Pride was kind of the whole reason for his downfall. And Nolan sort of just replaces it with him being angry and stupid. His stupidity actively kills some of his guys, and the question at that point is, why does anybody follow him? Like, eventually they stop following him, but like, it doesn't explain why the military commander risks soldiers still alive to retaliate against the monster that killed soldiers that he can't bring back. Homer makes Odysseus too proud to leave his victory as anonymous. He has to tell the Cyclops, I am Odysseus, king of Ithaca. Hear my name and remember me, you villain you. Where Nolan makes him too angry to leave a defeated monster alone. One flaw reveals why this man is brilliant and also self-destructive. And the other, it just makes me wonder why anyone would continue trusting him to command after this. This is the first point where Odysseus' intelligence stops feeling like a defined trait and starts feeling like something the movie gives him or takes away according to whatever consequence Nolan actually needs at the time. And to understand why Nolan rebuilt him this way, we have to go back to the Trojan horse. So again, I get what Nolan is doing here. His sort of thesis statement for the film is, what if the cleverest thing that Odysseus ever did as this clever warrior man was also the worst thing that he could possibly do for civilization? What if the Trojan horse taught the world to weaponize sacred trust, and the victory that made Odysseus a legend became this thing that he couldn't ever forgive himself for, and he was guilt-ridden for the next 10 years? There's a lot interesting to that. Homer had Odysseus weep when the horse and the sack of Troy are sung about in Menelaus' halls, so grief over the war isn't some ridiculous modern thing that Nolan pasted onto the film, but Nolan doesn't let that grief complicate Odysseus. He sort of makes it his only defining trait. And the film is pretty open about that. The horse is this false peace offering that he tells the Trojans, hey, this is for you guys. They bring it in. Odysseus broke Zeus's law. It's the trust is broken forever, and the breach is spread outwards into the sea people, and Odysseus spends the voyage back basically avoiding all of the consequences of his actions. He made this happen. Like, I'm mocking it, but like there is a good film concept in there. This just wasn't the one for it. And maybe Nolan just isn't the guy for it. I don't know. I just don't buy the causal weight that we're placing on this guilt. Paris exploited Menelaus' hospitality before the war started. 10 whole years of slaughter preceded the horse that supposedly destroyed the sacred trust. War is not the same thing as the xenia of entering a stranger's home and being a guest in their house. There's obviously an argument to be made about the horse doing something to humanity. There is a massive breach of trust going on there with the sacred nature of the gods to these people, which that's a conversation to have, but don't make it the only thing you have in your epic, sprawling Odyssey. The Oppenheimer comparison that everyone's been making is also something that kind of explains why this doesn't necessarily feel right for the story. And I have no idea why this is what Nolan did. If this was intentional, I mean, it had to be intentional, right? But okay, Odysseus is basically the moral poster boy for the Odyssey's version of the atomic bomb. Even ancillary characters like Sinon become just another face for Odysseus's guilt to be reflected on. And yeah, maybe Nolan was the guy for the Trojan horse as the atomic bomb kind of story, but I'm just not really convinced he was the guy to tell Homer's story. The film kind of routes the entirety of the story through this language of guilt and collapse of civilization, the idea of Zeus's law, and it again uses that as an example, as a reason for Odysseus to go west. It works, but it is such paint-by-numbers storytelling. I think actually the largest casualty of this sort of driving force of the film being Odysseus' guilt is the concept of nostos, which is homecoming. Odysseus is not unwavering in Homer. He does waste time, he follows appetites, he lets his curiosity and his pride sort of dictate how he makes decisions, and it creates delays, it really does. But the poem's direction is always homebound. That is the point of the story. Ithaca is this fixed point that gives every temptation, every disaster they run into, every disguise that Odysseus needs to take, every loss that he encounters, that homeward destination, that's what gives his journey meaning. And Nolan makes the destination itself kind of wishy-washy and uncertain. Nolan's sort of collapsing of the lotus flowers and Calypso's island definitely adds to this in ways that I don't really like all that much. Homer's interpretation of Calypso was this imprisonment that neither of them really wanted but were forced to be a part of, and he's weeping for his wife, and ultimately Hermes has to come, give him the rowboat or the, pallet. What do you use? Boat? Raft, that's the word. Hermes came and gave him a raft and sent him on his way. Eventually he gets back to Ithaca that way. But here, he doesn't really want to go. No one sort of turns Calypso's island into this willing anesthesia. Like, he actively makes him not really certain if he wants to go home. And the sirens are actually making that reversal very explicit. Nolan basically uses the sirens as an excuse to tell the audience that Odysseus doesn't really want to go home. Which, is this not crazy? Are we not living in Fantasyland here? This is the Odyssey. This is Odysseus we're talking about. Everything becomes guilt in this story. His curiosity with the sirens becomes guilt. His captivity at the hands of Calypso, it also becomes guilt. The hospitality that he's dealing with Circe, that and Polyphemus, that also becomes this sort of guilt. Well, not Polyphemus. Polyphemus is, what even is that? Is there any thematic connection? I think it's just they put that scene there because they knew they needed to have it. Every road leads back to the horse, even when the episode was built from another part of Odysseus. And the whole Odysseus's need for control, that argument, that also comes into play here. And it sucks because it infects other characters too, especially the crew, who we basically know nothing about. They're all just blank NPCs pretty much, except for Eurylochus, but even he, like, nobody's gonna remember his name unless they know the story. I think the fact that we don't know the crew at all is also just, on its own, something that's really rough as a story. Of course, Nolan has to condense things, make some people less important, some people more. I get that, but the priorities just seem so off for this movie. Eurylochus often just feels like the designated spokesperson for all the other people in the crew. They just feel like numbers, bro. They don't matter at all to him. And I think one of the bigger things too that really impacted the way a lot of this felt was the removal of the divine politics. I think that just really contracts all the causality because the gods have a lot of influence in the Odyssey. They actually have a pretty significant plot role. So the fact that Nolan makes them so ambiguous, it sort of removes a lot of the networking and connective tissue that sort of holds this story together. Athena being transformed into basically what everything else in this film was transformed into, which is Odysseus's guilt, that really removes a lot of the forward momentum of the Telemachy. It removes a lot of the agency that we see from Odysseus in the story. And this is not me being angry that Nolan had an interpretation for the film. It's me watching the interpretation replace the character. The fact that people will look at this guy and say this is Homer's version of the story. This is Homer's Odysseus. He's the clever, many-turning, wily trickster that we all know and love. That upsets me a little bit, that people will leave the theater thinking that this is Homer. It's just not. I mean, Ithaca is frankly where this should all pay off. The return ought to feel like a powder keg about to explode. Every disguise, every test of loyalty, every delayed recognition, it's all packing this pressure together in the story until this climactic final fight. It's insane. It's insane how climactic it is to read it and how much this film just deflates. This is kind of where Agamemnon comes in, because when you get to Ithaca, just surviving the journey, it doesn't mean that your home is going to welcome you with open arms. Homer gave Agamemnon this sort of battlefield glory too, but needless to say, I was very confused the whole time why they gave him this Achilles level of stature and significance with the armor, which is always like associated traditionally with Achilles. Like Aristus Achaean, best of the Achaeans. Like it totally doesn't fit. Agamemnon does establish this failed parallel version of Nostos. Nolan's guilt thesis has its chance to become personal when Odysseus meets the son who understands Troy as this heroic glory that is told in songs, and you know, he's been hearing about this since he was a boy. Telemachus is interesting because he builds his father as this image from stories that he's been told as a child. And their reunion is just kind of lame. Like, there was a little bit of emotion to it, but the reunion between Telemachus and Odysseus, and even the moment with the dog, like, the Argos bit, that should be a tearjerker, man. I didn't feel much at all with that. Like, that was probably the most I did feel in the film, but like, man, there was just a lot more opportunity, I think, for emotion. Oh, and that final massacre sequence, oh my god, the fight choreography. Don't even get me started. It sort of brings back all of the intelligence issues and honor issues that we saw with the Cyclops. Homer starts with Odysseus killing Antinous. They did a whole thing with Antinous in this film for some reason. Again, priorities. This film has him kill a different guy mid-sentence in the throat. sort of contradicts his whole honor bow pluck thing. You know what? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And then, man, oh man, I just don't think Nolan knows how to do fight choreography. Like, at this point, I don't get it. You have everyone standing in the wings, waiting for one or two people at a time to go in and strike and just get beat the piss out of. Odysseus should not be fighting solo in this, by the way. I don't know if you know, but Telemachus and Eumaeus and another guy, I think the cowherder, somebody else was involved and helped fight all the suitors. That wasn't the case here. They had to prevent that to allow Telemachus to become king of Ithaca, which was also not really from the source material, but Telemachus also receives this whole coming of age arc, but it never really pays off. His whole maturation is never complete, and then he's just given the kingdom. Like, Penelope is screaming at him at the beginning of this movie, calling him a child, and he doesn't ever really grow or do anything. He just sort of gets stabbed, and that's it. I think the biggest absence, though, has to be the marriage bed. That is such a crazy thing to leave out. I cannot imagine the thoughts going through Chris's head when he was thinking, all right, how do we want to end this film? He said, bet, we're gonna make it about the end of civilization itself. What does that have to do with Odysseus? I think this is one of the big things about Nolan that really irks me sometimes, is that he's everyone says he's a very cerebral filmmaker, but honestly, I'm starting to not even believe that. He's just incapable of making coherent events at this point. But okay, let's say, for example, he is very cerebral and he's sort of detaching the emotion and sort of keeping the big concept alive, right? Okay, fine. He has this idea of, at the end, they're going west to honor the dead and to sort of, I guess, restore some faith in humanity. I don't know. But this is what they replaced the marriage bed scene with. So this final test that Penelope creates for Odysseus is essentially one of understanding if her husband is still there. Odysseus, through this whole journey, is going through his mind being like, is the Odysseus that I left going to be the one that returns to my wife? And the answer is probably no. But the question Penelope is asking is this still my husband? And the marriage bed sequence, I'm not even gonna spoil it. I'm not even gonna tell you. Just read the Odyssey. I am genuinely curious if people that have not seen or read or listened to the Odyssey before, I wonder if those people have some indication of what the story is actually telling you. When the credits start rolling after Matt Damon's final crazy exposition dump, what are you thinking? What is going through your mind? What do you think Nolan is actually telling you? His choices are legible, but those choices being legible doesn't mean that the replacement performs the same amount of dramatic work. I personally don't think it serves even a fraction of that. Odysseus' cunning in Homer saved his men, it doomed his men, it tested loyalties, and it ultimately reclaimed his household. Penelope's got this cheeky sort of Odyssean intelligence herself that allows her to test the marriage. And Telemachus, he has this maturation through his reclaiming of his household with his father side by side. The divine relationships with characters like Athena and Poseidon, they give those choices consequences. Those mortal choices that these people make, it gives those consequences. And of course, the concept of nostos is what gives everything in the story this sort of delayed gratification that is culminated with the return to Ithaca. The Odyssey came from this oral tradition shaped by a lot more than one poet, but it's built around human choice inside a divine world. I guess the point is that Nolan changes that so drastically that all of this stuff that originally existed is now compressed into one man's guilt, which is kind of boring. Adaptation doesn't require you to copy every single event. It doesn't require you to mirror exactly what the story has. That would be impossible for this kind of film with this kind of story length. Like, it's not possible. I get that. But if Nolan cared about adapting this thing properly, it would mean understanding the events before declaring them as expendable. While the screenplay does preserve a lot of what Homer's itinerary was, and it recognizes the journey enough to visually feel like Homer, he just wasn't the guy to adapt the Odyssey. And look, if you like this version of Odysseus and the Odyssey, the journey, that's fine. More power to you. I can't necessarily empathize, but you know, I totally get it. Spectacle is absolutely a part of the reason we enjoy these experiences, and I don't begrudge you for enjoying it. I just can't connect with it because of what it is. It is Chris Nolan's Odyssey with Chris Nolan's Odysseus. This just isn't Homer. Anyways, just listen to Stephen Fry audiobooks or Epic the Musical. Those somehow are more faithful. Also, go watch my Percy Jackson videos up to this point. If you haven't seen them, I'll finish the series eventually, I promise. Okay, bye!